The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and recycled air, the kind of place where time felt suspended, and people whispered as if sound itself could be held against them. I was seated at the narrow table on the left, my hands folded, my back straight, my eyes forward. Before the judge even entered, my husband leaned closer, just enough that no one else could hear him. "You lost," he whispered, his voice low, smooth, certain. I didn't turn my head. I didn't blink. I didn't react. From the corner of my vision, I saw her first. The woman sitting beside him let out a soft laugh, quickly disguising it as a cough. It was the kind of laugh people make when they believe the outcome is inevitable, when empathy feels unnecessary because victory is already theirs. She shifted in her chair, relaxed, comfortable, like she was watching the final minutes of a game whose score had long been decided. They exchanged a look, not a loving one, not even a cruel one. It was a look of agreement, of shared confidence, of people who believed this room, this judge, this process were nothing more than formalities. I kept my gaze fixed ahead. When the bailiff announced the judge, the room stood. The sudden scrape of chairs echoed off the walls, sharp and hollow. We sat again as the judge took his seat, glasses perched low on his nose, his expression unreadable. He opened the case file in front of him, flipped the first page, then the next. Silence stretched. He kept reading. The seconds felt longer than they should have, long enough for discomfort to creep in, long enough for the air to feel heavier, long enough for the faint smile on my husband's face to tighten just slightly. The judge turned another page. Everyone in that room believed the story was already over. The only question was whether the judge knew it yet. I had learned, over the past year, how quickly people decide who you are in moments like this. The defeated wife, the emotional liability. The woman who had stayed too long and waited too patiently. I could feel it in the sideways glances from strangers seated behind me, in the subtle pity that clung to the room like dust. They expected tears, or anger, or collapse. They were waiting for a performance. My husband sat back in his chair, one arm draped casually along the table. He looked bored, like someone waiting for a delayed flight. To him, this hearing was not a reckoning. It was a box to check. Something inconvenient standing between him and whatever came next. He had already moved on in his mind, already begun narrating his future without me in it. She leaned closer to him, whispering something I couldn't hear. He smirked. The sound of it wasn't audible, but I felt it anyway, sharp and dismissive. They were so certain that I had nothing left to say, certain that I had no leverage, no authority, no final move. They believed silence meant surrender. What they didn't understand was that silence can also mean restraint. The judge paused again, his finger resting on a line of text. He removed his glasses and looked down at the file once more, his expression thoughtful, his mouth set in a neutral line. It was an odd pause, too long to be meaningless, too deliberate to be routine. I glanced just once at the file on his desk. Plain, unmarked. Nothing about it drew attention. That was the point. Behind me, someone shifted in their seat. A quiet sigh escaped somewhere in the room. Time felt elastic, stretching and tightening all at once. The confidence on the other side of the table hadn't vanished, but it wavered, the way certainty does when it's forced to wait. I thought about how easily they had reached this moment believing I would disappear quietly, how often they had spoken for me, decided for me, planned around me. How comfortable they had grown with the idea that I would simply accept whatever was handed down. I had accepted many things before: compromise, silence, being underestimated. This wasn't one of them. The judge adjusted the stack of papers, aligning the edges with care. He set the file down, folded his hands, and lifted his gaze toward the attorneys' tables. The room seemed to inhale as one, a collective breath held in anticipation. My husband straightened slightly, confidence still intact but no longer careless. She stopped smiling. I remained still. Whatever happened next would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It wouldn't look like revenge the way people imagine it in movies, but it would change everything. The judge drew in a breath, preparing to speak. And in that suspended moment, before a single word was said, I knew with absolute clarity that the story they thought they were finishing had only just begun. The judge's silence pulled me backward in a way I hadn't expected, not to another courtroom or another argument, but to a version of myself I barely recognized anymore. The woman I had been before all of this, before my name felt negotiable, before my place in my own life became something other people felt entitled to rearrange. Years earlier, I was not waiting to be chosen. I had a full life, a steady sense of direction, and a quiet confidence that came from standing on my own feet. I lived alone in a small but well-kept apartment, worked long hours by choice, and filled my weekends with routines that belonged entirely to me. I believed in partnership, not rescue. I believed love was something that expanded your life, not replaced it. I met him in a way that felt ordinary at the time, which is why it never raised alarms. There was no dramatic spark, no cinematic moment. We were introduced through mutual acquaintances at a professional conference out of town, the kind where conversations blur together and most names are forgotten by the end of the day. He was attentive in a way that felt rare. He listened without interrupting. He asked thoughtful questions and waited for the answers. I remember thinking how refreshing it was that he didn't rush intimacy. He didn't overwhelm me with charm or promises. Instead, he mirrored my pace, my values, my language. When I spoke about my work, he didn't minimize it or redirect the conversation back to himself. He treated my independence like an asset, not a threat. We kept in touch after that weekend. Emails turned into calls. Calls turned into dinners whenever our schedules aligned. He spoke often about building something lasting, about stability, about the importance of loyalty. It felt mature, intentional. The kind of relationship people admire from the outside because it seems grounded, sensible, safe. When he eventually introduced me to the idea of a future together, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like a step. I trusted him, not because he dazzled me, but because he never needed to. He made space for my opinions. He praised my judgment. He spoke about us as a unit, a partnership where decisions were shared and respect was mutual. He talked about his family early on, but always carefully. They were successful, close-knit, deeply invested in legacy. He framed it as pride, not pressure. I noticed how precise his language was when he spoke about them, how nothing felt spontaneous, but I mistook that for thoughtfulness. I didn't yet understand how much weight family approval carried for him, or how easily loyalty could shift when power was involved. There was a moment, early in our relationship, that stayed with me long after. We were walking back from dinner one evening, the city quiet around us, when he said, almost casually, "I don't believe in blindsiding people. If I ever stop choosing someone, they'll know." I remember smiling at that, touched by what sounded like integrity. I took it as a promise, not realizing how carefully worded it was. Our relationship moved quickly but not recklessly. We planned, we discussed, we aligned. When we married, it felt like a continuation of something already solid, not the beginning of something fragile. I believed we were choosing each other with open eyes. Looking back now, I see the small details I couldn't interpret then. His comfort with control. His need to be perceived as competent in every room. The way he bristled, just slightly when he felt his authority questioned, even by people he claimed to respect. At the time, those traits read as confidence, leadership, strength. They didn't feel dangerous. The first year of our marriage reinforced everything I believed. We functioned well together. Decisions were made collaboratively. Plans were discussed before they were acted on. When disagreements arose, they were framed as problems to solve, not battles to win. I felt secure in a way I hadn't before, not because I depended on him, but because I believed he saw me as an equal. That belief made the next phase easier to accept. When conversations began shifting toward practicality, toward sacrifices framed as temporary and necessary, I didn't resist. Love, I thought, required flexibility. Commitment meant sometimes stepping back so the bigger picture could move forward. He never asked abruptly. He never demanded. He reasoned, explained, reassured. And I listened. I didn't know yet that this was the moment where love stopped being purely emotional and started becoming transactional, where words like partnership began to quietly change their meaning, where my willingness to compromise would be noted, cataloged, and eventually expected. As I sat in that courtroom years later, waiting for a judge to speak, I understood something with painful clarity. The woman who had trusted so fully wasn't foolish. She was deliberate. She made choices based on the information she had, on the person she believed she was standing beside. What she couldn't see was how easily trust could be repurposed, how promises could be honored in spirit while being violated in practice, how a future could be built in a way that slowly edited her out. That realization didn't fill me with regret. It filled me with resolve. Because if I had once been capable of building a life alongside him, then I was capable of rebuilding one without him. And this time, I would be paying attention to every detail he assumed I would overlook. There was a season when everything felt aligned, when our lives moved forward with a shared sense of momentum that made doubt seem unnecessary. We talked about the future in practical terms, not fantasies. Where we would live, how we would structure our work, what kind of life we wanted to build. It felt adult, deliberate, earned. That was when his ambition sharpened. It didn't arrive as a warning or a rupture. It came dressed as opportunity. A shift in his professional world that promised visibility, influence, and long-term security if handled correctly. He spoke about it calmly, confidently, as if the path forward were obvious. The only variable, he explained, was focus. "This next phase matters," he told me one evening, his tone measured. "If I get this right, everything else gets easier." I believed him, not because I was dazzled, but because the logic made sense. He wasn't asking for blind faith. He was laying out a strategy, temporary pressure for permanent stability, a familiar trade-off. One people make all the time. The ask itself was almost understated. He didn't frame it as sacrifice. He framed it as efficiency. There were certain roles, certain appearances, certain decisions that would be cleaner if handled through him. Less friction, fewer questions. "It's just for now," he said, "until things settle." He made it sound like a favor I was uniquely qualified to give. I hesitated briefly, not because I didn't trust him, but because the shift was subtle enough to feel consequential without being dramatic. It meant stepping back from visibility, letting his name carry weight where mine had once been spoken alongside it, allowing certain responsibilities to be unofficial, undocumented, assumed rather than acknowledged. He noticed my pause and responded exactly the way someone confident in their position does. He reassured me, thanked me, told me how much he valued my judgment, how he couldn't do this without me, how my support was the reason he felt strong enough to move forward. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. That contribution didn't need an audience. That trust meant allowing flexibility when circumstances demanded it. So I said yes. At first, the results were immediate and gratifying. His work accelerated, doors opened, people listened. He was praised publicly for decisions we had discussed privately, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing I had been part of that momentum. He thanked me often, at home, behind closed doors. I told myself that was enough. But something shifted almost imperceptibly. In public, my role became less defined. Introductions changed. Where I had once been included by default, I was now adjacent, still present, still polite, but no longer central. When people praised his success, they rarely mentioned me. When they did, it was as support, background, encouragement. I corrected it once, casually, a small clarification in conversation. He smiled, nodded, and moved on. It didn't feel worth pressing. Then came the paperwork. It was presented as routine, administrative, a formality required to streamline things while everything was in motion. He explained it carefully, confidently, the way someone does when they believe the explanation itself is the solution. I skimmed the pages, trusting the framework more than the details. There was a moment, pen hovering above the paper, when something in me tightened. Not fear, just awareness. A sense that this wasn't reversible in the way other compromises had been. He noticed. "Don't overthink it," he said gently. "This protects us." Us. The word still worked then. I signed. The change wasn't immediate, but it was real. Decisions started arriving already made. Information came later, filtered, summarized. He spoke more often about my work than our plans. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't cruel, it was incremental, quiet. I told myself this was temporary, that once the pressure eased, balance would return, that love wasn't measured by titles or credit. That trust meant allowing someone to lead when circumstances required it. What I didn't see was how permission functions. Once given, it doesn't ask to be renewed. The first true crack appeared in a moment so small it almost escaped notice. We were at a gathering, nothing formal, just a mix of acquaintances and colleagues. Someone asked me a question about a decision I had helped shape, and before I could answer, he did. Confidently, correctly, completely. I smiled and let it pass. Later, alone, I mentioned it lightly, not as an accusation, just an observation. He laughed it off, kissed my forehead, told me I was reading too much into it, that he was just speaking quickly, filling space. I accepted the explanation because accepting it was easier than challenging what it implied. Looking back, I understand now that this wasn't betrayal. Not yet. It was calibration, a quiet testing of boundaries, an adjustment to see what would be noticed, what would be questioned, what would be allowed. I allowed more than I should have. Because love, as I understood it then, was about strength through unity. About giving when you could, trusting that balance would eventually return. I believed sacrifice was mutual, even when it wasn't simultaneous. What I didn't understand was who sacrifice empowers. By the time I began to sense that something had tilted permanently, the structure was already in place. The roles had been reassigned, the language had shifted. And my silence, once offered in good faith, had begun to sound like consent. That was the first thing I gave up without calling it a loss, and it would not be the last. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly, almost politely, the way real exclusions often do. Invitations arrived later than they used to, sometimes through him instead of directly to me. Conversations slowed when I entered the room, then resumed with a different tone, lighter, safer, as if something had been edited out for my benefit. At first, I blamed stress. His work had intensified, and with it, the family's attention. Success has a way of pulling people into tighter formations, and I assumed I was simply misreading the room. Families have rhythms, after all. They adjust, they recalibrate. I told myself I was still learning theirs, but the pattern persisted. At dinners, I noticed how praise flowed freely toward him, how his achievements were recounted with pride and specificity. Dates, figures, decisions. When my name came up at all, it was usually attached to a word like supportive or patient. No one asked for my perspective. No one followed up with questions. I smiled, I listened, I stayed pleasant. The tone was set by his aunt, a woman whose presence carried weight without ever demanding it. She wasn't unkind. That was the most unsettling part. She spoke softly, carefully, choosing her words the way people do when they believe they are being generous with wisdom. "You have to understand roles," she told me once, her hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. "Families function best when everyone knows where they fit." She said it kindly, almost maternally, as if she were offering guidance instead of a boundary. I nodded, unsure why the comment unsettled me. At the time, it felt like advice. In hindsight, it was a warning. As his visibility grew, so did their deference to him. Decisions were announced at gatherings as Feit's accomplice. Plans discussed without preamble. I learned about them in the same way distant relatives did, through casual mentions and confident assumptions. When I asked questions, they were met with brief explanations, often redirected toward him for confirmation. He didn't contradict them. There was a moment that stayed with me, sharp in its ordinariness. Someone thanked him for handling a situation I had managed almost entirely on my own. He accepted the praise without hesitation, without malice, as if the correction simply hadn't occurred to him. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that it wasn't worth creating tension over something so small. I was wrong. The first time I realized conversations were happening without me, it wasn't because someone slipped up. It was because no one bothered to hide it. I overheard fragments of discussion about stability, about optics, about the importance of keeping things streamlined. My name wasn't mentioned, but my absence was implied. They weren't reacting to me, they were evaluating. The clearest line was drawn during a family meeting I hadn't known was a meeting. A decision was presented regarding finances and future planning, framed as settled, necessary, efficient. When I asked when it had been discussed, the answer was casual, almost dismissive. "It didn't really concern you," someone said, smiling as if that settled it. Later, alone, I asked him about it, not angrily, not accusatorily, just confused. "It was easier this way," he said. "They move fast. You know how they are." I nodded, swallowing the discomfort that rose in my chest. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was what partnership looked like when families were involved, that not every decision required my input. But something fundamental had changed. I began to understand the hierarchy I hadn't seen before. Blood mattered. Legacy mattered. Marriage, it turned out, was conditional. I was welcome as long as I didn't complicate the structure, as long as I didn't insist on occupying space they hadn't allocated to me. The realization came slowly, then all at once. I saw how easily I could be repositioned, how quickly narratives could be rewritten, how silence, when shared by enough people, becomes policy. When I finally voiced my unease to him, choosing my words carefully, he responded with a familiar calm that now felt different. "You're reading too much into this," he said. "They don't mean anything by it." There was an edge to his tone, subtle but present, as if my concern itself were an inconvenience. He suggested I let it go. Focus on us. Avoid creating friction where none was intended. I apologized for bringing it up. That was when I began to censor myself. Not consciously at first, just small edits. Questions left unasked, thoughts withheld. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, equilibrium would return. That love required patience, especially when other forces were at play. What I didn't yet see was that patience was being mistaken for compliance. By the time I noticed how far the line had moved, it was no longer clear where it had started. The warmth I once felt in those rooms had cooled into something formal, transactional. I was no longer family in the way I had believed. I was an accessory to a structure that had already decided what it needed from me, and what it didn't. As I sat with that understanding, a quiet clarity settled in. Love hadn't failed me first. Belonging had. I didn't know then how carefully they were planning for a future that didn't include me. I only knew that I had stopped being seen as permanent. And once that happens, everything else becomes negotiable. Her name started appearing in conversations the way background noise does, faint at first, easy to ignore. A passing mention over dinner, a reference in a phone call I overheard while pouring coffee. Each time, it was framed as necessity, as someone who made things easier, smoother, more efficient. I didn't think much of it at first. People come and go in professional circles all the time. Names surface, linger, disappear. I trusted the context he provided, and I trusted myself not to be threatened by shadows. The first time I met her, it was in a neutral space, public enough to feel harmless. She was introduced with a smile and a string of compliments that felt rehearsed, capable, Organized, indispensable. She shook my hand confidently, holding my gaze just long enough to register familiarity that hadn't been earned. What struck me wasn't her appearance or her confidence. It was how much she already knew. She referenced timelines I hadn't been part of, spoke casually about decisions that hadn't been discussed with me, anticipated outcomes with a certainty that suggested access, not intuition. When I looked to him for clarification, he offered it quickly, smoothly. "She's very perceptive," he said. "We talk a lot about work." I nodded, telling myself that competence often looks like overreach when you're not used to sharing space. That this discomfort was mine to manage, not hers to justify. But the moments kept accumulating. She knew when meetings ran late before I did. She referenced travel plans I hadn't heard about. She spoke as if she understood his preferences intimately, from the way he liked information presented to the decisions he avoided making himself. None of it was overt. None of it was inappropriate on its own. Together, it formed a pattern I couldn't quite name yet. What unsettled me most was how others responded to her. His family, in particular, welcomed her with a warmth that felt immediate, unearned. They praised her efficiency, her insight, her understanding of the bigger picture. When she wasn't present, her name still came up, always in context of how helpful she had been. I noticed the contrast. I was there, physically present, but peripheral. She was absent, yet central. The illusion finally fractured during a gathering that should have been routine. We were seated together, discussing plans that affected all of us. I offered a thought, careful, measured, grounded in experience. Before anyone could respond, she smiled gently and corrected me, reframing my point as if I had misunderstood the situation. "It actually makes more sense this way," she said, turning to him for confirmation. He nodded without hesitation. The room accepted the exchange without comment. No one looked to me. No one waited for my response. It was as if my authority had quietly expired, replaced without ceremony. I felt the humiliation sharply, a clean cut rather than a dull ache. I didn't react. I didn't argue. I simply withdrew, listening as the conversation continued without me. Later, alone, I asked him about it. Not accusing, just honest. "She overstepped," I said. It felt like she was speaking for me. He sighed, a sound that carried impatience more than concern. "You're being sensitive," he replied. "She's just trying to help. You know how these situations are." That was the first time he framed my discomfort as insecurity. The first time he suggested that my perception, not the behavior itself, was the problem. It landed harder than I expected. Not because it hurt, but because it shifted something fundamental between us. I started asking myself different questions. Not whether he was cheating. Not yet. I asked why I no longer seemed necessary. Affairs, I realized, don't always begin with desire. Sometimes they begin with displacement, with the quiet removal of relevance, with the gradual introduction of someone who fills a space you didn't know was being emptied. I watched more closely after that. I paid attention to how she moved through rooms, how she spoke with authority that wasn't hers by right, how she deferred to him publicly while steering him privately. I noticed how comfortable she was, how little she worried about boundaries. She didn't need to hide, because no one expected her to. When I raised my concerns again, framing them carefully, he reassured me in the same measured tone he always used when he wanted to end a conversation without resolving it. He told me I was imagining patterns where none existed. That stress was getting to me. That I needed to trust him. I tried. But trust requires visibility, and mine was fading. The most unsettling realization came quietly, without drama. I understood that she wasn't an addition to our lives. She was a solution, a way to streamline, to simplify, to replace complexity with compliance. She fit where I no longer did, not because she was better, but because she was more convenient. She knew her role, and everyone else seemed to know it too. I wasn't being pushed out forcefully. I was being edged out methodically, my presence reduced to a formality, my objections reframed as emotional noise. The danger wasn't that he chose her over me. It was that the choice had already been made, and I was the last to be informed. As that understanding settled in, something else shifted with it. The confusion gave way to clarity, the self-doubt began to lift. In its place was a sharper awareness, a recognition that this wasn't about rivalry or romance, it was about erasure. And the moment I understood that was the moment I stopped wondering if I was overreacting. Because nothing threatens people more than the quiet realization that they are no longer invisible to the person they assumed would never see them coming. I stopped asking myself why everything felt wrong and started asking what exactly had changed. It was a small shift in mindset, but it altered the way I moved through my days. Feelings could be dismissed. Patterns could not. Once I began paying attention, the changes were impossible to ignore. Information that used to reach me automatically now arrived filtered, summarized, sometimes not at all. Emails that once included me by default no longer did. Meetings were mentioned after they happened, decisions explained only when they needed to be. It was all framed as efficiency, as speed, as an attempt to spare me unnecessary details. "You don't need to worry about this part," he told me more than once. "It's moving fast." The language was protective on the surface, but underneath it carried something else. I was being shielded out of relevance. The financial side followed the same pattern. Nothing blatant, nothing dramatic, just a gradual narrowing of access. Statements stopped appearing where they used to. Accounts were referenced vaguely, numbers were rounded, approximated, described instead of shown. When I asked questions, the answers came easily, confidently, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable enough to quiet doubt. For a while it worked. Then I noticed how often her authority filled the gaps where mine used to be. People deferred to her without hesitation. They looked to her for confirmation, for approval, for clarity. It happened casually, without announcement, as if it had always been this way. And somehow, without deciding to, I found myself deferring too. There was a moment that crystallized it for me. Someone asked a question about a process I had once overseen. Before I could respond, they turned to her. She answered smoothly, accurately, without even glancing in my direction. No one corrected the assumption, not him, not me. I felt something settle in my chest then, not panic, not anger, but recognition. The language he used began to change as well. Past decisions were reframed, subtly but consistently. Things we had discussed became things he had planned. Agreements turned into approvals. When I disagreed, he spoke with such certainty that I found myself questioning my own memory. "That was always the understanding," he said more than once. Gaslighting doesn't arrive with raised voices or obvious cruelty. It arrives quietly, through repetition, through confidence, through the steady erosion of your trust in your own recollection. I noticed how carefully he avoided direct confrontation, how he dismissed concerns without engaging them, how every conversation ended with me feeling unreasonable for having raised it. Eventually, I stopped trying to resolve anything out loud. That was a decision. I realized that reacting emotionally no longer served me. It gave him information. It confirmed his narrative. So I adjusted. I asked fewer questions. I listened more. I stopped offering corrections. I observed. And what I observed was design. One afternoon, while organizing documents that had piled up without my attention, I came across something that didn't belong. It wasn't incriminating on its own, just a detail that didn't align with the explanations I had been given. A date that didn't match a timeline. A reference that contradicted a story I had been told repeatedly. Small, but precise. I didn't confront him with it. I didn't mention it at all. Instead, I noted it, mentally, then physically. I began keeping my own records, my own quiet archive of inconsistencies. I paid attention to how often explanations shifted depending on the audience. I listened for what was said and, more importantly, what was avoided. The more I watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't impulsive behavior or emotional confusion. It was structured, planned, executed with care. I wasn't being pushed out because things were falling apart. I was being replaced because things were coming together. That realization changed everything. Fear has a way of making you reactive. Clarity makes you still. Once I understood the scope of what was happening, panic lost its grip on me. In its place was something colder, more useful. I knew then that confrontation would only accelerate the process. That warning them would serve no purpose. They believed I was unaware, and that belief was my advantage. So I stayed quiet. I maintained routines. I responded politely. I let them assume I was resigned, confused, overwhelmed. I watched how comfortable they grew in that assumption, how careless certainty made them. It was strange, realizing that the people who should have warned me were already involved. His family's silence, her confidence, his dismissals all fit together now. The pattern wasn't just personal, it was institutional. I wasn't losing my place by accident. I was being edited out deliberately. And the most dangerous part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how ordinary it had been made to feel. How easily it could have gone unnoticed if I had kept asking myself why instead of what. By the time I reached that understanding, I no longer felt like the woman waiting for something to happen to her. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a map, finally able to see the terrain clearly. They thought I was retreating. In reality, I was learning the shape of the trap they had built, not so I could escape it, but so I could decide exactly where to step next. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and once you understand the design, you stop being surprised by the outcome. You start preparing for it. It came together on an afternoon so ordinary it almost felt cruel. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a casual exchange that assumed I wasn't listening closely enough to matter. They were standing in the kitchen, his voice low, hers lighter, almost amused. I was in the adjoining room, sorting through a drawer that had become a graveyard for things no one wanted to deal with anymore. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was simply there. "She'll be gone by then," she said, as if discussing a scheduling inconvenience. "We just have to make sure everything's aligned before that." He didn't correct her. He didn't hesitate. "That's the plan," he replied. "Timing matters." I froze, my hand still wrapped around a stack of old documents. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't stop talking. They spoke with the ease of people who believed the outcome was settled, the way you speak when the variable you once worried about has already been removed from the equation. In that moment, the confusion I had been carrying snapped into clarity. This wasn't about an affair. It wasn't about love or desire or even betrayal in the way I had been taught to recognize it. This was a plan, deliberate, structured, built around assumptions that treated my absence as a certainty, not a possibility. They talked about dates, about milestones, about how things would look once everything was finalized. Language like transition and continuity floated through the air, clean and clinical. My name never came up. It didn't need to. I understood then how they saw me. Not as a partner who had fallen out of favor, not even as a problem to be managed. I was a phase, a placeholder, a necessary step that had already served its purpose. The shock was brief. Pain followed, sharp and undeniable, but it didn't last long. What replaced it was something steadier, colder, useful. I finally understood why arguments had stopped, why discussions no longer invited my input, why my objections were met with calm dismissal instead of frustration. They weren't trying to convince me anymore. They had moved past that stage. This wasn't personal, it was procedural. The family's role became clear in the days that followed. Conversations I had once found vague now made sense. The quiet encouragement, the strategic silence, advice given in the language of pragmatism rather than morality. They weren't choosing sides. They were protecting a structure, and I was no longer part of it. The woman I had been measuring myself against wasn't competing with me. She was filling a vacancy. She fit seamlessly into the framework they had designed, not because she was extraordinary, but because she was compliant. She asked fewer questions. She understood the value of timing. She accepted her role without challenging its boundaries. She wasn't the threat. The plan was. The most chilling discovery came later that evening, when I found reference to a date circled on a calendar I wasn't meant to see. Not a celebration, not a meeting, a marker. A point of no return, after which decisions would be irreversible. After which my leverage, whatever remained of it, would dissolve completely. They had given themselves a deadline, and I had never been informed. Panic tried to surface then, rising quickly, urgently. I felt it press against my chest, demand release. But I didn't let it. Panic would make me visible. Panic would make me predictable. Instead, I did nothing. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't reveal what I had heard or what I now understood. I let them believe their assumptions were correct, that I was unaware, that I was overwhelmed, that I was quietly preparing to accept whatever outcome they had planned for me. That belief was the most valuable thing they gave me. I became agreeable. I nodded when decisions were explained after the fact. I thanked them for updates. I played the role they expected with precision. I watched how their confidence grew in response, how certainty made them careless. It was almost startling how quickly people relax when they believe the threat is past. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer wanted to be included. I no longer needed reassurance. I didn't need them to understand me or see my value. I needed them to underestimate it. They thought they were preparing for my exit. I was preparing for their mistake. The silence I maintained wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It gave me time. It gave me clarity. It allowed me to see how deeply the plan ran, how many people were invested in it, how fragile it actually was once exposed to scrutiny. By the end of that week, I knew exactly where I stood. I was no longer reacting to betrayal. I was responding to strategy. And for the first time since this quiet war had begun, I felt something close to control. Not because I had power yet, but because I understood where it lived, how it moved, and how easily it could be disrupted if approached correctly. They believed I was still trying to save my place. I wasn't. I was learning how to take it back on my own terms. Because the moment someone assumes you are already gone is the moment they stop guarding the door. And I had no intention of leaving quietly. They stopped pretending after that. The shift was subtle in timing, but brutal in effect, moving from quiet exclusion to something far more visible. It happened at an event where appearances mattered, where smiles were currency and silence carried weight. The room was full of people who knew our names, people whose opinions could open doors or close them. Conversations flowed easily until I joined them, then recalibrated just enough to remind me I was no longer central. My husband moved through the space with ease, greeting people confidently, speaking for both of us without once looking to see if I agreed. I noticed how he positioned himself physically, always a half step ahead of me, always angled outward. It wasn't accidental, it was a statement. She was there too, standing close enough to be included, far enough to maintain plausible distance. When she spoke, people listened. When she smiled, they responded. She carried herself like someone who already belonged, someone who didn't need to ask permission. At one point, a discussion turned to a project I had once overseen. I waited, expecting someone to glance my way to invite my input. Instead, she stepped in smoothly, outlining decisions and timelines with confidence. She spoke as if she were clarifying something obvious, correcting a minor misunderstanding. "It's already been handled," she said lightly, turning toward him. He nodded. The conversation moved on. No one looked at me. The humiliation landed quietly, without spectacle. It didn't sting like an insult. It settled like a verdict. This was how it would be now, publicly, visibly, unmistakably. I felt the familiar surge rise in my chest, the instinct to speak, to correct the record, to remind them all of who I was and what I had contributed. I felt it press against my throat, demanding release. I didn't give it what it wanted. Instead, I smiled. I thanked someone for their time. I stepped back and let the conversation continue without me. I felt every second of it. The dismissal, the casual cruelty, the way my absence was treated as efficiency rather than loss. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was theater. They wanted an audience. They wanted confirmation that I understood my new position. They wanted to see how I would react. I didn't. Later, when we were alone but not truly private, he addressed it casually, as if discussing logistics. "This is just how things need to look right now," he said. "You know how these situations are." His tone suggested patience, reasonableness. It implied that my acceptance was expected, that resistance would be inconvenient rather than justified. When I didn't respond immediately, he sighed. "You're not upset, are you?" he asked. "There's no reason to be." The gaslighting was so smooth it almost impressed me. He framed the humiliation as necessity, the dismissal as strategy. He suggested that reacting would only make things worse, that my composure was evidence of maturity. I nodded. That was when the line inside me finally shifted. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped hoping someone would step in, would notice, would correct the imbalance. I understood then that this wasn't about miscommunication or oversight. This was deliberate positioning, and they believed it was working. They believed I was shrinking. In reality, something else was happening. Hurt was hardening into something more controlled. Fear was giving way to calculation. Every slight, every public dismissal, every moment of imposed invisibility was teaching me how they operated when they felt secure. They were careless when they believed they had already won. I watched how confidently they spoke, how openly they assumed my compliance. I listened to the language they used when discussing the future, how casually they referred to plans that no longer included me. I noted who stayed silent, who nodded, who avoided eye contact. Silence, I learned, is not neutrality. It is alignment. The more they underestimated me, the more room I had to observe without interference. They didn't guard their words around me anymore. They didn't monitor what I saw or heard. They assumed the damage had already been done. That assumption was their greatest mistake. That night, alone, I sat with the weight of what had happened. Not the humiliation itself, but the intention behind it. This wasn't meant to push me away emotionally. It was meant to position me socially, to redefine my role in a way that would be difficult to undo later. They were making sure that when the final step came, no one would be surprised. I understood then that reacting would only confirm their narrative. It would make me look unstable, emotional, resistant to inevitability. Staying quiet preserved ambiguity. It kept them guessing just enough to remain careless. So I chose restraint. Not because I was broken, but because I wasn't. They thought humiliation would neutralize me, that public dismissal would weaken whatever resolve I had left. They believed they were watching me fade into the background, finally accepting the role they had assigned. What they didn't see was the discipline it took to stand there, to feel every slight and still refuse to perform. That discipline changed me. I stopped asking for fairness. I stopped expecting protection. I stopped hoping for kindness from people who had already chosen efficiency over integrity. And in that space, stripped of illusion, I found something steadier than anger. Clarity. They believed this was the moment I broke. It was actually the moment I stopped playing defense. Because when someone thinks they've already won, they stop watching their blind spots. And I was standing directly in one of them. They believed they understood me completely by then. The emotional wife, the patient one, the person who had always softened first, adjusted fastest, stayed quiet longest. Their plan depended on that version of me remaining intact. What they never bothered to learn was how much of myself I had never put on display. Long before my marriage, before I ever shared a life with him, I had learned how systems worked. Not just people, but structures, contracts, authority. The quiet rules that govern who has power and who doesn't when everything is stripped down to paper and process. It wasn't something I advertised. It had never needed to be. While they assumed I was unraveling, I was reviewing. I started with the documents I still had access to, the ones that hadn't been filtered away yet. Old agreements, emails saved out of habit, records I had once glanced at casually and now read with intention. I wasn't searching for proof of betrayal. I was looking for exposure. What I found wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream scandal or wrongdoing. It whispered vulnerability, inconsistencies in authority, decisions made out of sequence, approvals granted by people who technically didn't have the standing to grant them. Nothing illegal on its own, but fragile when assembled. That was when I made my first quiet call. I didn't frame it as a crisis. I didn't tell a story. I asked procedural questions, the kind that sound hypothetical until they aren't. I spoke carefully, neutrally, as if I were curious rather than concerned. On the other end of the line, there was a pause, then a shift in tone. "That would be a problem," the voice said, "if it's documented." It was the confirmation I needed. I didn't rush. I didn't confront anyone. I understood then that timing mattered more than speed. I continued to act as I always had, polite, agreeable, present but disengaged. I let them believe the performance had worked, that humiliation had done what it was meant to do. In the background, I began assembling my own record. I reread agreements with a different eye, noting language that had once seemed benign. I tracked timelines, cross-referenced statements, and mapped out where assumptions had replaced formal approval. I kept everything factual, unemotional, dates, names, sequences. It wasn't about catching them in a lie. It was about understanding where the structure failed under scrutiny. The more I worked, the calmer I became. Fear requires uncertainty. Once I understood the contours of what they had built, fear lost its urgency. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. There were moments when doubt crept in, quiet and insistent. What if I was wrong? What if I was overestimating my position? What if none of this mattered in the end? Those moments passed quickly, because each time I returned to the facts, to the paper trail they had grown careless with, clarity returned. They had mistaken my silence for ignorance. They had confused my restraint with helplessness. They assumed I wouldn't know where to look. I kept my preparation deliberately unremarkable. No dramatic meetings, no whispered alliances, just methodical work done in small increments, invisible to anyone who wasn't searching for it. I created a file, plain and unassuming, and added to it piece by piece. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. Every so often I would catch glimpses of their confidence hardening into certainty. He spoke more freely about the future. She stopped pretending to defer. Plans were discussed openly, timelines assumed, outcomes spoken as fact. They thought the next move was theirs. They didn't see the risk they were carrying because it didn't look like risk to them. It looked like control, familiarity, momentum. They believed the system would protect them because the system always had. What they didn't understand was that systems don't protect people. They protect processes, and processes fail when they're handled carelessly. I stayed quiet because surprise only works once. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them unguarded. I wanted them convinced that the worst had already happened and that whatever remained was cleanup. The night before everything shifted, I sat alone with the file open in front of me, not reading it, just looking at it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not revenge, not vindication, just balance. I didn't feel anger then. I felt steadiness, the kind that comes when you stop asking for permission to exist in your own story. They had planned carefully, I would give them that, but they had planned around the wrong version of me. By the time I closed the file, I knew exactly where and when it would be seen. I knew who would read it and what questions it would raise. I knew the silence it would create and how uncomfortable that silence would be for people used to controlling the narrative. They believed the ending was already written. I knew better. Because the moment someone underestimates your understanding of the rules is the moment they hand you leverage without realizing it. And I was done being underestimated. By then, they were no longer cautious. Confidence had settled into them like a second skin, comfortable and unquestioned. They spoke about the future as if it were already happening, as if the outcome were a technicality rather than a turning point. He talked openly about what would come next, where he would focus his energy, how much simpler things would be once everything was resolved. His voice carried relief, even anticipation, like someone finishing an unpleasant task. She listened closely, nodding, adding details, already arranging her place in a life she believed was secured. They spoke about me as if I were a problem already solved. "This won't take long," he said one evening, scrolling through his phone while I sat across from him. "The judge will want to move it along." She smiled at that, a small, knowing curve of her mouth. "It's obvious how this will go." I kept my expression neutral. I asked no questions. I offered no resistance. I let their certainty fill the room. They mistook my silence for acceptance. In the days leading up to the hearing, everything around them took on an air of finality. Conversations were framed in past tense, even when discussing the present. Decisions were made with casual authority. I noticed how often he used phrases like "after this" or "once it's over," as if my presence were already a footnote. I continued my routines. I answered when spoken to. I nodded at explanations offered too late to matter. I watched how relaxed they became, how little effort they made to hide anything anymore. Carelessness is a luxury people indulge in when they believe there's no longer a threat. Behind that calm, my own preparation reached its quiet conclusion. I reviewed the file one last time, not because I doubted its contents, but because I wanted to be certain there were no loose ends. Everything was there, organized deliberately, stripped of commentary or accusation. Just facts, just sequences. Just questions waiting to be asked by someone with the authority to ask them. It looked unremarkable, almost boring. That was intentional. Drama invites dismissal. Precision demands attention. The night before the hearing was strangely still. No arguments, no emotional exchanges. He slept easily, breathing slow and even, while I lay awake, not replaying memories or rehearsing confrontations, but thinking about timing, about process, about the way power shifts not through force, but through interruption. I didn't feel fear. Fear requires uncertainty. What I felt was readiness. In the morning, the house moved with mechanical efficiency. Coffee brewed, doors closed. Goodbyes were brief, polite, almost cordial. She arrived dressed carefully, her confidence reflected in every choice she made. She looked like someone attending an event she expected to enjoy. On the drive to the courthouse, they spoke lightly, discussing schedules and errands for later in the day. There was laughter, relaxed and unguarded. I listened without engaging, my attention focused inward, steady and clear. They believed they were walking toward an ending. I knew better. The courthouse itself was unremarkable, a building designed to neutralize emotion. Inside, the air felt heavy with expectation. They took their seats with practiced ease, settling in as if the space already belonged to them. He leaned back, one arm draped casually along the table, scanning the room with mild disinterest. She glanced at me once, quickly, then looked away, satisfied. The file rested quietly in my bag. No labels, no markings, nothing to suggest the weight it carried. To anyone else, it was just paper. To them, it was nothing at all. At one point, he leaned toward her and murmured something under his breath. She laughed softly, the sound sharp in the hushed room. I caught a fragment of his words, just enough to recognize the tone. "She doesn't have anything," he said. They smiled, certain it was over. I understood then how thoroughly they believed in their version of reality, how complete their dismissal of me had become. They had built an ending where I faded quietly, where my role concluded without consequence, where my silence was interpreted as defeat. They never questioned why I had stopped arguing. They never asked what I was doing instead. As the judge entered and the room rose, I felt no surge of adrenaline, no rush of vindication, just focus. The kind that comes when you know exactly what you are about to do and why. I placed the file on the table in front of me, my hand resting lightly on top of it. Plain, unassuming, invisible to them. They were still smiling. They didn't know that this was the moment their certainty became dangerous. Because confidence blinds people to interruption. It convinces them that nothing unexpected remains. that all variables have been accounted for. They walked into that courtroom believing the story was already written. I walked in knowing I was about to hand the pen to someone who had no interest in their narrative. And once that happened, it wouldn't matter how loudly they laughed or how confidently they dismissed me. The file they thought meant nothing was about to change everything. They just didn't know it yet. The courtroom felt smaller when we filed back in, as if the walls had edged closer overnight. The same wooden benches, the same flags, the same quiet authority in the air. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He took his seat with the ease of someone who expected efficiency. His attorney shuffled papers confidently, already prepared to move things along. She sat close enough to be seen, not close enough to be questioned, her posture relaxed, her expression faintly amused. They behaved like people waiting for confirmation, not scrutiny. The judge entered, and the room stood. When we sat again, the judge glanced down at the docket, then up at the attorneys, eyes sharp but unreadable. Their side went first. The attorney spoke smoothly, outlining a version of events that reduced me to an obstacle. Emotional, uncooperative, peripheral. He framed decisions as necessary and inevitable, described timelines as settled, and emphasized efficiency as if speed were proof of fairness. He spoke as though nothing remained to be examined. My husband nodded at the right moments, his confidence intact. When the attorney suggested the court move forward without delay, he leaned back, satisfied. I sat still. There was a moment, brief but telling, when the attorney referred to documents already reviewed, implying there was nothing new to consider. He requested the court proceed. Speed, I had learned, is the privilege of people who believe nothing can interrupt them. My turn came without fanfare, no dramatic preface, no raised voice, just a simple request to submit additional material for the court's consideration. The file was handed up, plain, unmarked, unassuming. He glanced at it with disinterest, barely acknowledging its presence. She smiled, the corner of her mouth lifting in quiet dismissal. To them, it looked like nothing. The judge accepted the file, adjusted it on the bench, and opened it. The room settled into silence. At first it was the ordinary kind, the pause that accompanies routine reading. But then the pause lengthened. Pages turned slowly, deliberately. The judge's expression didn't change, but the rhythm did. Reading stopped, resumed, stopped again. My husband shifted in his seat. The attorney leaned forward just slightly. She stopped smiling. The judge removed his glasses and read another page without them, his brow tightening by a fraction. The silence thickened, pressing against the room, pulling attention inward. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Finally, the judge looked up. He didn't speak right away. He asked a question instead, technical, specific, directed at my husband's counsel. The attorney answered easily at first, confidence intact, but the judge interrupted with a follow-up. Another question, then another. Each one narrower than the last, each one rooted in a detail they hadn't expected to explain. The attorney's tone shifted. The certainty thinned. My husband leaned forward now, his relaxed posture gone, eyes fixed on the bench. She glanced between them, confusion flickering across her face for the first time. The judge returned to the file. More pages turned. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably unimpressed. He reframed the issue in a way they hadn't anticipated, identifying a procedural concern they had assumed invisible. He referenced timelines, authority, sequence. He didn't accuse, he didn't speculate. He simply described what the file presented and what questions it raised. The air in the room changed. What had been certainty collapsed into recalculation. The judge outlined immediate steps. Not a final ruling, but a decisive interruption. Certain actions were paused. Certain assumptions were suspended. Oversight was introduced where none had been expected. He set boundaries. He fixed my husband with a look that held neither anger nor sympathy, only expectation. These matters require further examination, he said evenly. "Until then, the court will not proceed as requested." The words landed quietly. They were devastating. The attorney stood, attempting to recover ground, but the judge was already moving on, setting dates, defining scope, establishing scrutiny. The rhythm of control had shifted, and it was no longer theirs. I watched it happen without expression. My husband's face had lost its ease, the confidence replaced by something tighter, more guarded. She sat very still now, her presence suddenly conspicuous, her earlier certainty nowhere to be found. The room no longer accommodated their narrative. Power doesn't disappear loudly, it evaporates the moment the right authority questions it. When the judge adjourned, the gavel's sound was soft but final. Chairs scraped again as the room stood, but this time the movement felt different. Disordered. Uncertain. As we filed out, the attorney murmured urgently to my husband, already shifting strategies. She lingered behind them, no longer included, her eyes darting as if searching for reassurance that didn't arrive. In the hallway, voices overlapped, tension crackling just beneath the surface. I stepped away from it all, moving forward without hurry, without triumph. I didn't smile. I didn't look back. I breathed. They had walked into that courtroom believing the case was over, that the outcome was inevitable, that my silence meant surrender. They left knowing they had misjudged the ground beneath their feet. Nothing had been decided yet, but everything had changed, and for the first time since this began, the weight I had been carrying lifted. Not because I had won, but because I had been heard. The rest would unfold in time. I had already done what I came to do. The hallway outside the courtroom felt strangely quiet, as if sound itself had decided to give me space. Behind me, voices overlapped in low, urgent tones, but I didn't turn around. I kept walking, my steps steady, my shoulders light in a way they hadn't been for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was release. For months, maybe longer, I had carried the weight of being spoken for, decided around, quietly dismissed. That weight wasn't gone because someone else had lost. It was gone because I had finally reclaimed something that should never have been negotiable in the first place. My voice, my standing, my right to be taken seriously. As I moved down the marble steps and out into the daylight, the shift in power became visible in small, telling ways. People who had avoided my eyes moments earlier now looked uncertain. Conversation stopped when I passed, not out of pity but recalculation. The certainty that had protected them was gone, replaced by questions they hadn't prepared for. He stood a few feet away, speaking urgently with his attorney. His posture was different now, no longer expansive, no longer relaxed. The ease he had worn like armor in the courtroom was gone, replaced by something brittle. He didn't look at me, not directly. When he finally did, there was no anger in his eyes. There was confusion. She lingered nearby, suddenly unsure of where she belonged. No one was deferring to her anymore. No one was including her in strategy or reassurance. The role she had stepped into so confidently no longer existed. Whatever protection she thought proximity had given her had evaporated the moment scrutiny arrived. I understood then how temporary usefulness can be. I didn't approach either of them. There was nothing left to say. Words would have cheapened what had just happened, reduced it to a confrontation instead of what it truly was. A correction. What I walked away with wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the dramatic sense people imagine. What I gained was autonomy, boundaries reinforced by authority, a future no longer dictated by other people's assumptions. What I left behind was just as important. I left behind the illusion that being agreeable would protect me, the belief that patience would eventually be rewarded, the hope that silence would earn me fairness. I no longer needed to be chosen by people who had already decided my value was conditional. In the weeks that followed, things settled slowly, deliberately. Processes moved forward under watchful eyes. Conversations became more careful. Decisions that had once been rushed were now examined, questioned, documented. I didn't rush anything. I didn't press for spectacle. I allowed the structure to do what it was designed to do when properly engaged. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with restraint. Outside the conflict, my life began to feel like my own again. Not magically, not overnight, but honestly. I made choices without waiting for approval. I spoke without rehearsing how my words might be dismissed. I occupied space without apologizing for it. There were moments of grief, of course. You don't walk away from something like this without mourning the version of the future you once believed in. But grief, when acknowledged, loses its power to paralyze. It becomes part of the story instead of the ending. The most important lesson came quietly, long after the courtroom emptied and the adrenaline faded. Being quiet is not the same as being weak. Being patient is not the same as being blind. And being underestimated can be dangerous, but only for the people doing the underestimating. They laughed because they believed power was permanent, because they thought control was something you could claim without question, because they assumed the system would always favor those who moved confidently through it. They were wrong. Power shifts the moment someone refuses to disappear. If you're listening to this, and parts of it feel uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever been sidelined, spoken over, or written out of your own story, know this: you are not invisible. And silence, when chosen deliberately, can be one of the most powerful tools you have. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I paid attention. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had already won? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want to hear more real stories about justice, resilience, and moments when the tables finally turn, stay with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join this community. Some endings don't come with applause, they come with clarity. And sometimes that's the most powerful victory of all.